Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is employment attorney Peter Rahbar. Peter, thanks for coming on again.
Great to be here, Brittany. Thanks for having me.
Great to have you as always. And as we know, screenwriters have been on strike for over 100 days. And as we also know, actors soon followed. Reportedly, over 300,000 workers in the U.S. have been on strike in 2023. So this summer was dubbed Hot Labor Summer. Before we get into it, can you explain what that means?
Sure. It certainly has been a hot labor summer. There's been a lot of attention paid to issues revolving around employees, particularly those in unions and those on strike right now. And if you look at the numbers, it's kind of funny because we have approximately 150 million workers in the workforce in the U.S., and 11 to 12% of those workers are unionized. And as you said, 300,000 of them are on strike at one point or another this summer, some right now. So we're talking about a small percentage of the workforce, but a real outsized impact because these are people we know who the actors are, we know the writers and the shows they work on, we know UPS threatened to strike this weekend, we know who the UPS delivery people are. Right now the automakers union is threatening to go on strike right now, which could be another 150,000 workers going on strike, which would be a monumental labor action. So these are people we know, we're familiar with, and the issues are ones that we're very familiar with as well. So it's generated a lot of interest. There's been years of decline in unionization and interest in unions, but the unions have taken this moment where a lot of different trends are coming together to capitalize and really make the most of striking against employers.
I do want to talk about the why here. You mentioned a variety of different fields, auto workers, UPS workers, actors. Why are they all going on strike, and is this unprecedented?
Well, we've had different phases of organized labor activism. Certainly this is unprecedented in modern times because, as I said before, the trends have really been against unionization, against striking. I mean, strikes are really the ultimate job action that a group of employees could take. But the reason why we're seeing this happen right now, in my view, is really the convergence of a couple different things. One is, the increased cost of living that everybody's facing, the corresponding lack of wage increases to, meet that increased cost of living, lack of trust that employees have in employers that can come from anything, such as like a return to work policy or a wage conversation or how a employer handles or doesn't handle an employee complaint. And then also there are random things that come into the equation. Like in this case, in 2023, I would say AI is playing a role too. And at least in the writer strike and in the actor strike, that's a major issue. And while it plays a different role for writers and actors, pretty much everyone is sitting around thinking, hey, am I going to be replaced by AI? And let's see how this fight between the writers and the studios and the actors in the studios plays out. And is there anything I can use in my own, day-to-day negotiations with my employer on that topic?
I do want to talk about AI a little bit more. I've had many conversations across the spectrum about AI. The first thing everyone says is, am I going to lose my job? You're an employment attorney. What do you think? Do you think people are going to lose their jobs based on this really emergence of AI?
Well, it's a really relevant question. So it's a question that everyone should be asking and everyone should be thinking about. Now, do I personally see it as a development that's going to replace hundreds of thousands or millions of jobs? Probably not. What we've seen in history of the workforce and of technological developments is that every time there's a big new technological development, something that's transformative, such as AI, and I do believe that AI will be transformative, there's been a shift in jobs, not a replacement of jobs. So there still needs to be people who administer, who create, who work with these tools. I mean, we've already seen dozens of new industries pop up, to work with AI and help employers work with AI, et cetera. So I would say it's definitely a question you should ask, and you should definitely make sure you're not in a position where you are totally replaceable. And if you really want extra bonus points and be doing the real like top strategy right now, I think you should be presenting yourself as an expert on how to use AI, how to understand AI, how to use the tools. And you should be talking with your employer about that. If you're a job candidate, that's something you should surely be developing and noting on your resume and job applications. If you're in college, you should be taking classes about it. No matter what field you're in, that should be something that should be noted when you're either talking with a new prospective employer or your current employer.
How, if you're the employee, do you bring AI into that conversation? Because right now it almost seems like that elephant in the room you don't want to address because you almost don't want to bring attention to, hey, like that could replace me one day.
It's certainly a valid concern. I mean, I totally understand that, but I think fear is the wrong strategy. I think what you should really do is embrace and understand the tools that are relevant to your job. And if there's a tool that could make your job better, that could make your job more productive, or it could be helpful to a company that you can be the master of, then that's certainly something that you can take and approach your boss or your manager about and talk about how you can be a point person within the company to either utilize those tools or teach people about them or work with your managers and figure out how to integrate them into the workflow.
I do now want to take a step back and talk about how the labor strike is really impacting everyone, employers versus employees. For the first time, I think, in modern history that I've seen, a few years ago, we saw the employees really have the power. We saw that with quiet quitting. Now it might seem that power dynamics changing with quiet cutting. First, explain what that is and who really holds the power these days. Is it the employer or the employee?
Well, what we're seeing is a full-fledged battle for control of the workplace. I don't think there's a winner or prevailing party right now, but I do think it's notable that employees have more power than ever. I mean, we're coming out of several decades where employers have held all the cards, have held all the power, have imposed their will on employees, and now employees are fighting back. And so employers, you may see tools like quiet cutting, which is reassigning people to jobs that maybe they weren't hired for or not qualified for, and then slowly forcing them out of companies. You may see some of that, and we've seen that historically, and I've seen a number of instances of that this summer in my practice. But employees hold more power than ever, and these strikes are evidence of that. Employees are not afraid to quit jobs. They're not afraid to ask for more money. They're not afraid to raise complaints. They're not afraid to share information with each other. And there are so many ways they can do that, whether it's through a union, through Glassdoor, through simple Google spreadsheets that they pass around amongst each other. There's a real growing sense of employee activism that I think is here to stay. And that's very frustrating to some employers. You could even see it in some of the quotes that CEOs, very accomplished, polished CEOs, have given in the context of these strikes that are just complete misfires. Bob Iger is a prime example when, he said that the actors and the writers needed to be more reasonable. And, here's someone who's making tens of millions of dollars every year telling, people who are making a tiny fraction of that they need to be more reasonable in their demands. So employees are not afraid. And if you're an employer, you have to understand that. You have to be considerate in your communications. You have to be frequent in your communications. If you have a narrative about your company or about a particular job action that you want to, express, you need to do it. Because if you don't do it, employees will fill in that blank space with their own version of what's happening and why it's happening and who it's happening to. So there are definitely lessons for both sides here.
Let's talk about the lessons for the employers first. When Bob Iger released that statement, it sounded like he really had a tin ear. He wasn't listening to their demands. What do you think is the correct response instead, and how could someone like him course correct?
Well, a statement like that might have worked, 10 years ago, but right now with social media and with, the means of communication that employees have, employees can share their proposals with the world from the bargaining table within seconds, right? So there's going to be very little spinning possible when each side has that capability. It used to be that the employers control most of the information flow. They don't. Here, employees have equal access to information. So, what's the proper response in a strike situation or on a topic like wages? I think being reasonable, being fair, expressing a wish to reach a reasonable solution rather than name calling or accusations or branding one side right or wrong. I think reasonableness carries the day. I mean, what we are seeing right now in the workplace is that employees want to be heard, they want to be treated fairly, and they want to be treated respectfully. A comment like that from Mr. Iger is not really checking those boxes. But on a day-to-day basis, if you're a manager and an employer, you need to remember that. You need to be respectful, you need to be fair, you need to be open. Employers are really looking for a voice right now, and you need to provide them with that lane. If you don't, they're going to go somewhere else and find it.
What do you think was the catalyst here for this worker empowerment? Because I remember just generations back, maybe our parents, our grandparents, they stayed at a job for 40 years, put their head down, collected their paycheck. Now employees are much more outspoken. Why do you think that shift occurred?
It's a great question, and I think there's going to be a lot of studies done on this and a lot of research. I mean, I would say, and from my perspective, this is something that's been building for many years now. If you go back to the days of Jack Welch, where he took a company like NBC and said, or General Electric and NBC, and said, we're not going to be this company where people should expect long careers and benefits, and we're not going to refer to this place as a family. We're going to cut pensions. We're going to cut workers every year. Well, shareholders first, employees second. That attitude, which has built up over the last few decades, I think has really hit a wall with the pandemic when employees said, hey, I put my life on the line to come to work. I spend every hour of the day helping keep this company afloat. What's in it for me? Where's your compassion? We've now come out of the crisis phase of the pandemic, and a lot of employers have been very deaf in their policies of return to work and other related issues, like demanding that employees come back for certain numbers of days of the week without consulting with employees first or without any regard to issues that employees still may have in their lives, including mental health and other family effects from the pandemic. So those are some real things that are coming together that sort of have contributed to the rise in employee activism. And I think you just layer on the ability to share information. I mean, that is just so essential. It used to be that employers had all the salary data and it was a black box. Now employees have that too. And so they've really worked together to empower in a lot of ways that maybe they haven't realized the implications of. But here we are, and now there's a real fight going on for control of the workplace.
And as this hot labor summer is winding down, we just passed Labor Day, you always give us some takeaway advice. Gives us some takeaway advice if you're an employer, an employee. What should you do? What's the next course of action?
Yeah, well, if you're an employee, I would start there and just say, it's a good time to be visible. It's a good time to show your relevance, and you always want to put yourself in a position where you're irreplaceable to the people you work for, and that's a good way to avoid quiet cutting and some of these other trends that we're seeing, okay? But it's also a time to remember, like, you have rights, you have options. If you don't like your job, there are other options out there. The stigma of quitting, the stigma of, taking another job, those are gone. I've worked with people who've been at companies for decades who are like, I just need a change. And I've always been afraid to do it, and now I'm going to do it. And there are a lot of stories like that out there. So I would say if you're an employee, you're not happy with your job, work on your skills, take a look out there, see what's out there. There's never been a better time to evaluate your options and make a move. If you're an employer, I think you have to tread really carefully. That's been my advice for the past year or so. I'm going to stick with it. You need to listen to your employees. You need to give them a voice. You need to include them on major decisions. And you need to be fair and reasonable when you do come to major decisions. So something like AI that we've talked about, that should not be a one-sided discussion. Employees should be involved in how AI is rolled out and implemented in a business. return to work policies, this is still a relevant topic, and it's one that employees, I think, have to have input on. Again, this should not be a one-sided, decision from an employer. We talk a lot about what policies employers implement. We don't talk about the fact that most of them fail. The reality is that the big places like Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan, they're still having trouble getting employees into the office, no matter what the policies are. So it's a time to listen to your employees, give them a voice, because if not, you may end up with a union on your hands. You may end up with complaints and government investigators or lawyers. Employees are not just going to, or you may lose your best talent. And that's really a steep price to pay, because employees are not just going to take it anymore.
That's really interesting that you say most of the policies fail. How do you get them to succeed then?
I think you need employee buy-in, and you need you need to listen to what your employees are saying. You need to be as flexible as possible. You need to be reasonable. You need to give people time to adapt. I mean, I heard about a company last week that changed their return to work policy within a week and gave employees 1 week notice. Now, how can you expect employees to A, be happy about it, B, comply with it, and C, have trust in you if you're just going to turn on a dime like that with such an important topic that's relevant to their life?
That's really a short amount of time, but I am curious, do you think we are going to see a hot labor fall?
Well, if we look at the temperature outside,
I know it's still a hot labor heat wave out there, but
absolutely. I think we will. I think we'll continue to see it. And, right now we don't know whether the UAW auto workers are going to go on strike. As I said, that's 150,000 workers who could be going on strike, and that would be very disruptive. And it would, get a lot of attention, because we're talking about, a lot of workers. We likely will have government involvement. It will be a hot political issue, and that's another thing we didn't talk about. But politicians look for issues to cling to and interest groups to support them, and you could be sure that politicians will attach themselves to these issues and a lot of these labor disputes and really amplify their visibility.
When it comes to the politics side of this, who do you think, where will Democrats fall? Where will Republicans fall? What are you thinking there?
Well, historically, the lines have been Democrats supporting labor unions and more employer-oriented causes, and Republicans taking the other side, supporting business interests. We've seen a couple Republicans break off and pick fights with major companies. DeSantis and Disney would be one of them. I mean, that's been pretty rare to see, but historically, labor issues are Democratic candidate issues, and I would expect to see the same going forward. Of course, I would say all politicians are in favor of increased employment and healthy economies and things like that. So, I mean, if there's an angle that a Republican can take in a labor dispute that would support that, I'm sure they would. They are opportunists, and they look for opportunities to take advantage of, and they're no different here.
Peter Rahbar, per usual, I really appreciate your insights. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.